Hello and welcome to the Voice Lecture Podcast. My name is Tayo and I am here with...
Sadhana.
And what are we here to talk about, Sadhana?
We're here to talk about one of my articles that I just put up on Voice called A Very Brief History of Broken Schooling.
Yeah, so as you've probably seen on the website, this month we're doing something to do with the new school curriculum. So ideas for how we would change the curriculum to make it better suit the world we're moving into. And where better to start than where we've had in history. So Sadhana's done a great article on this that will be linked. So I'm just going to start with the first question. When did schools start in England?
Well, the first act or piece of legislation to deal with education was in the late 1800s, and then after then, bit by bit, education became compulsory for between the ages of 5 and 12-ish, and it was kind of like a more localized system essentially that was kind of locally administered, and there wasn't really any centralization, which is kind of something that has changed, which I go on a little bit about in my article. And it's it's just interesting, I think, to look at how European models of education versus our model of education kind of have turned out. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
What do you think are the pros and cons to having this more centralized system?
I guess the pros, maybe not with our system. Ideally, the pros would be, giving everyone a really balanced worldview, or giving everyone skills to, things that everyone needs, like working in teams or mental health. These are my personal things that I think, would be really cool to have in a school system as a thing that everyone was able to access. But the cons are that, with our system, there's several flaws, and that centralization means that sometimes money only goes to some places, or the national curriculum fails to include everything maybe that we think is needed to prepare people for the future. So, there's pros and cons. Maybe it depends on who's in charge of that centralization system, or who gets a say. Because at the moment, I feel there's a lot of there's a lack of students being able to have a big say in what their schooling looks like. So yeah, there's loads of pros and cons, and those are just a couple of the things.
I guess a big thing with that would be for something like history, where because everything's nationalized, you don't get to tell these kind of local stories and local histories, which could help communities. But yeah, what would you say is the initial purpose of schools?
Initial purpose of schools. So there's this thing called factory education system, which people think is why mass compulsory schooling in the UK was made into a thing, which was that schools were used to get people ready to go into factory work and manual labor and sort of things, with having loads of people in a little classroom being taught repetitive things and bells and uniforms and all these different sorts of things that were kind of, people think that that's the aim of that, was to get people ready to work in factories. And with the sort of existing, even then, in the time when those stuff was created, there was a big inequality between state and private schools, where private schools would be obviously generously funded by rich, wealthy men, and the people there would be going into positions of power, and the state schools would be, pushing out loads and loads of people, massive class sizes, things like that, which kind of has dragged on till now. So yeah, that was the history of why people think compulsory mass schooling in the UK was sort of made into a thing.
Do you think that purpose has changed over time?
I think that's what's interesting, because like I talk about in my article, big disproportionate amount of MPs are privately educated. So like only 7% of the UK population attends private school, but around 29% of MPs are privately educated, and it's even worse with like judges. So like obviously those are powerful positions to be in the country. So if those inequalities are continuing on, that suggests that like those differences between private and state schools have still continued on because of, you know, the funding thing, and the fact that like if you're privately educated, you're more likely to have all these other things which really, really impact your experience at school, or like how well you're doing at school and your academic performance and things like that.
So, how do you think these issues of class within the schooling system can be changed?
How can they be changed? That's a good question, and I don't know, honestly. It's obviously I think it's really superbly exemplified in schools, but obviously classism comes in many forms, and often we don't have deep enough discussions about it. And yeah, I think I don't know the solution, but I think it's definitely something that we should start having more conversations about and start thinking about more.
I can throw you like two suggestions and let me know what you think about them. One of them is one that you've already mentioned in your article, which is the idea of abolishing grammar schools. So, much do you think that would affect equality and like social mobility and all those kinds of things in society on an
Uh,
educational
Grammar schools. I don't know. I think the like abolishing grammar schools might not change like the deeply entrenched like classism that we live in today. I don't think that's like enough. But I think that like I don't know, I haven't got a chance any time within the school to be like, whoa, this is like the purpose of school, this is where school came from, this is why school is the way it is now. And like I've never been able to have a discussion about that. And I was just currently like talking to some people over lockdown about school, and like having discussions with loads and loads of young people, about, you know, why is school the way it is? Is it really serving young people, or is it just like being used as a tool to like maintain the status quo, which is like a much big question about school and what its function is. So I think having those conversations and really including classism in that conversation, and thinking about that, is a start to trying to um, get away from, you know, these inequalities.
Yeah. And there's another thing that's been floated, abolishing private schools. So what do you think about that one?
Abolishing private schools. I don't know. I think there's some, obviously, from private education, we know that, like, you know, having more funding for education is evidently making a big difference to people's lives. So I don't know. Yeah, maybe abolishing private schools. I think I don't know. I really don't know. But like, if that will solve the problem, but it's
Yeah.
definitely something to think about. And like maybe I don't know, redistributing that money. Maybe like I think there's like such a big like there's so many options. There's so many things we could do, and I think we need to like think about it a lot and have start young people thinking about it. And I think that's thing that's kind of coming up right now with the A-level stuff, and people were ready to protest. People were organizing locally, for me, and they were doing postcode protest, I think it was called, but then everything got changed, so I don't know what happened to that, but people are starting to think about it, I think. So that's really cool.
So, moving away from just England or the UK, you talk about schools as kind of like a site of colonialism, focusing on residential schools. What are residential schools?
So residential schools are sort of schools that were put in place during colonial expansion to kind of assimilate young indigenous people into Western culture. So it's pretty horrible, really. So kids are taken away from their homes. They're like all their cultural ties are cut. Their like ties with their family, their language, everything's kind of pushed away from them, and they're forced to sometimes, like in the past, convert religion and things like that, and start focusing on like learning English and maths and things that we learn here, that might be useful to us, but it's kind of really, really distant from their lives and where they're living and their locality. Um, so it's really, really messed up. And this kind of happened during the expansion. This happened in Canada, America, and all over the world. But it's sort of still happening, which is the kind of scary bit. Um, but yeah, crazy.
Yeah, I think that's a lot. And I think even outside of those residential schools, how do colonial ideas kind of affect schooling currently within the UK or outside the UK?
Um, I think there's a really good documentary called The White Man's Last Burden, I think it's called. And it's just about like how, there was this, white man's myth that, you had to educate the locals and the savages, and like there's like pictures of them like dragging people into schools and like where they'd become civilized in quotation marks. um so like that thing of like hierarchy of Western knowledge still is super, super prevalent. um and that exists in like everywhere across the world. Like for example, in philosophy, my A level, I don't think we study anything that's not European. I couldn't tell you too much because I just started studying it, but I don't think we do. So it's like a thing that exists here in England, and it exists across the world because that kind of mindset kind of sets in after countries have been colonized, um, despite them, like that Western knowledge hierarchy thing. So yeah.
I mean, I guess it's the same thing. I can say it's the same thing for like politics. I think when I did the political ideologies module, they literally only had Western ideologies. The closest thing they had to a non-Western ideology was a really vague thing about multiculturalism, but even then, that's kind of a Western idea.
Mm.
So yeah, I don't know.
It's yeah, it's really strange. Not strange, it's like expected, I don't know. But it is, I think it, especially in India and stuff, like the ideal, I know from personal experience, like the ideal is trying to obtain that Western lifestyle still, and that also comes through in education and like the stuff they learn. And that documentary kind of highlights it, but they end up like learning facts about their local environment, like English names for the things that they exist, like the plants that exist around them, but they never like go out and look at them despite them being outside their like front door. So it's really, really seeped into education kind of all over the world.
Yeah, it's kind of a really big and hard thing to kind of deconstruct. But what do you think are some ways we could do it? Like, what are some starting points to decolonizing education, even if it's in like really small ways?
Really small ways. I think just having a chat about it, to be honest, I think, because like I think because we never get to have these conversations in school, because it's like you're being critical of the schooling system, and like it's kind of weird to have that within school, but like talking to other young people about like how broken schooling is, because often seems like this good thing that no one wants to talk critically about, and education is fundamental, I think, because that's where all the young people are at, and they're essential to making change and things. So like just talking to people about it, seeing what they think, what their experience was, because like often like I think aspects of schooling really don't work for a lot of young people, or people have problems with it, but never like think about that more deeply than just like, oh, my A level result got messed up because this stupid algorithm, or like, oh, I had this terrible experience, like sexist experience at school or racist experience at school, but never think like, oh, what does that mean about the actual schooling system? How is this messed up? So like really thinking about how deep that stuff goes and why it's like that and who that is like benefiting, I think, is a really good start. And once like all those young people start talking, I think it really could go somewhere in like making a change about all these things.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to end as any, just to really think more about the ways that education works in this country and more broadly, and the kind of ideologies it has underneath it.
Yeah.
So if people wanted to see more of your work, more of your writing in education, more of anything else you do, to be honest, where would they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Voice Mag, where I post some of my articles, and also on Instagram at sadhana.jpg.
Yeah, exactly. So today's episode was made possible by Voice Magazine, an online platform for young people interested in art and culture. You can read Voice over at voicemag.uk and find it on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as VoiceMagUK. The Voice contributors also run their own Instagram account at voice.extra. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider helping us to make more with a donation of any amount at voicemag.uk/donate. If you're looking for another podcast to listen to, the Voice Magazine podcast has weekly interviews with artists and leaders in the creative sector. And thanks to Kevin MacLeod for use of the chat shaving mirror. You can find more of his stuff on incompetech.com. It's all like really great and there's a wide variety. I don't know how he does it. And Tom Inniss was the executive producer of this podcast and is also the editor of Voice Mag. So please go give him thanks for this sort of stuff. And also, please rate, review, stars, give it all the stars, all that sort of stuff. Like if you want more of this stuff to happen, I guess. So yeah, thank you so much, and we will see you next week.